What we've been talking a lot about today is how we change the behavior of people in buildings. And what I want to talk about for a couple of minutes is how we've used a building to change behavior. Okay, what we had was the need to have people make a fundamental change in a deeply learned behavior, sometimes a multi-generational behavior, right away. Fortune Society serves about 3,000 people a year, most of them just out of prison, some of them as an alternative to incarceration. And we own a building called The Castle at 140th Street and Riverside in Harlem, which houses about 100 people a year, 60 at a time, with some turnover. What we needed to do to fit the gap in services that we were experiencing was house people regardless of whether or not they had violent convictions. But we needed to do it in a safe way. We are in a residential community, so we need to do it for our neighbors. But we also need to do it for ourselves, because the kind of change that we wanted to see doesn't happen when people are afraid. So we needed to guarantee people's physical safety and then work hard at emotional safety, which is a lot harder to guarantee. So this is the context, right? We work with people who come from a culture of violence. Most of them were victims of child abuse. Most of them grew up in juvenile institutions with violence. Many of them grew up in foster care with violence. They've all come out of jails and prisons where violence is a survival strategy. You're basically, as one of our guys said, you're the predator or the prey. Far, far better to be the predator. So what we're doing is speaking to people who come out of a system that is the antithesis of pretty much everything we value. I taught some classes in a prison in Delaware for a while. And what they did was they would give people an ID tag that they'd be penalized for not wearing. And the ID tag had a picture of them, but it was a picture of them when they got arrested. And as one guy who wore it backward, despite the risk of penalty, said, "This is a picture of me at the worst moment in my life. I'm not willing to wear it around my neck." So what prisons do is they look at people as the worst thing they ever did and treat them accordingly. And what I've learned about the human race is that people live up to the expectations or down to the expectations that you have of them most of the time, not all the time. People break out if you have negative expectations. They sometimes do some marvelous things. And people break out if you have positive expectations. They sometimes do some truly rotten things. But the question we had is, how do we bring people into our house when they've had a survival skill that's kept them alive, and they can't use that skill in our house because it'll jeopardize the space and everybody in it? So what we needed was a culture strong enough that when somebody walked in out of prison or out of one of the violence-ridden large city shelters that New York City chooses to invest in, what we needed was somebody to stop for a minute and realize this was different, and then hold still long enough to figure out what was different and not respond in the way that they were used to responding. And it was in the nature of an experiment, because most of the people we knew who did supportive housing wouldn't take people with long violent histories. And those were the people we had the hardest time placing. So we've put an enormous amount of energy into building a culture, because we need a culture powerful enough that it grabs people as they walk in. So here's what it takes in our experience, and we opened the place in 2002. I think we run one of the safest buildings in New York City, and we have people with pretty awful records in the mix. The first thing, I think, is about who our staff is. Most of our staff are people who've done time themselves. So immediately, somebody walks in our door, and they see somebody they know. They might have done time with them. It might have been the person who was the biggest problem in the neighborhood, the one the kids were told not to be like. And that person is there and is a role model. The next thing that happens when a person walks in is that we got about 60 people living there, mostly men, some women. And they're going to see people they did time with. So they're going to look to them for some modeling. The next thing we do is we talk to people, right? We tell them what the rules of the house are. And we offer them something really beautiful. It's a castle, right? It's a river view. It's a lovely, lovely building. And we say, you can live here. And people are coming from sleeping under a bridge, or they're coming from living in a large city shelter, or they're coming from Rikers Island, or they're coming from Greenhaven Prison. And it's like, I can live here? And the answer is, yeah, you can. But we need something from you. We have an absolute rule of no violence, no threat of violence. Break that rule, we'll still love you, we'll still work with you, but you can't live here. So it makes people stop for a minute. And we work very hard at building the culture. One of the things we do is we do a community meeting every Thursday night. I'm usually the one who runs it. If not, it's somebody else from the executive team. And it's a conversation that's meant to build the culture of the house. It's about what it takes to make the transition from one world to another, what it takes to handle conflict in a different way. And it's a lot of role modeling, because since we house people who turn over, since 100 people move through our house in about a year, the person who starts is always talking to people who are a couple of steps ahead of them, and they see them making those struggles, and we get to talk about them. So we started in 2002. It's about 8 years in. We've had about 700 people come through our house. I think I can count the instances of violence on the fingers of my hands. And violence mostly is somebody pushing somebody. We haven't had a serious incident in the house, and we've had people with horrific records. So it is possible to have a culture so powerful that somebody walking in with survival skills that mean you respond to conflict with violence realizes, I got to do something different without knowing what the different is and holding still long enough to figure it out, with role modeling all around. And it's a fascinating thing to see. It's actually really moving. And I welcome people to come visit. Thank you.